Wherever you are right now, do me a favor. Just perform a tiny, basic physical action. Raise your hand or tap your index finger on the surface in front of you. A single intentional tap. It feels obvious that you authored the movement. You thought about tapping the desk, your finger descended, and you felt the impact. But beneath your conscious awareness, a complex cognitive apparatus is firing on all cylinders in that exact fraction of a second. It is doing nothing else but trying to prove to you that you are the one in control. The experience feels seamless. Because these biological systems are the bedrock of human psychology, they operate completely out of sight. We don't notice them until we look at the clinical edge cases where they begin to fail. To understand the architecture of the self, we have to look past the healthy brain and reverse engineer the mind by examining where its internal physics engine breaks down. The self exists as a byproduct of this machinery. Its presence is only proven by observing the specific ways the system can fail. Let's trace the neurology of that finger tap. When you intend to move a limb, your brain relies on the comparator model. Your motor cortex sends a command down your spinal cord to move your muscles, but simultaneously, it sends an exact copy of that command to a different part of the brain. This is the efference copy. It acts as a high-fidelity simulation, calculating the specific tension in your muscles and the physical sensation of the wood before your skin makes contact. When your finger actually touches the desk, the brain acts as a comparator. It overlays that simulation onto the real-world sensory data returning from your hand. If the two match, the brain registers the feeling of agency, the implicit background buzz of control. What happens to a person's identity when this specific neurological hardware malfunctions and the brain fails to generate that predictive simulation? In patients with schizophrenia, neural imaging consistently reveals lower activity within the default mode network, the infrastructure responsible for self-referential processing. The internal forward model fails to function. When an internally generated thought or a motor command surfaces in their consciousness, the brain attempts to run the comparison process. But because the simulation failed, the signal that normally tags the thought with "I generated this" is absent. The brain registers a prediction error. The brain abhors ambiguity. It rationalizes this broken internal signal by constructing a narrative of an external controller to explain the input. Our deepest sense of internal agency relies entirely on the stability of that predictive loop. That predictive machinery works to prove our authorship by looking inward. But to survive, the brain must also look outward, scanning the environment to identify other intentional, goal-directed actors. This outward scanning is driven by the hypersensitive agency detection device. In ambiguous environments, this biological alarm system is hardwired to favor perceptual false positives. This hypersensitivity is the result of asymmetrical risk. If an early hominid looks at a patch of brush, assumes a movement is just the wind, and misses a stalking leopard, the cost is terminal. You are removed from the gene pool. Conversely, if you hear a rustle, assume it's a leopard, and run away from a breeze, you only lose a few calories. Because the cost of a false positive is so low, our biological smoke detector triggers an agency alarm at the slightest ambiguity. This bias explains haunted people syndrome. When individuals in noisy homes receive streams of ambiguous sensory data, the alarm signals the presence of an agent. Then, top-down cultural beliefs hijack this signal, causing the brain to render a ghost to resolve the data. Supernatural entities are a cognitive phenomenon, the result of our biological survival machinery working as designed, but interpreting data through specific cultural software. Our high-level identity structures are so protective of the narrative that we are in control that they will overwrite contradictory physical evidence to maintain it. To manage this, we rely on the judgment of agency. This acts as a cognitive buffer, using contextual logic and beliefs to filter and sometimes overrule the raw sensory realities of our bodies. You can observe this vulnerability at a craps table. High financial stakes and an intense desire for a specific outcome exert a powerful top-down influence on a player's perception. A player might throw the dice forcefully when they need a high number. When statistical randomness occasionally delivers that number, their judgment of agency retroactively assigns authorship to the throwing style. The conceptual brain manufactures an experience of agency over pure mathematical chance, protecting our identity as active authors of our environment. As we mature, this biological drive to remain in control scales up into the autobiographical author. This system weaves our past actions and future goals into a single cohesive narrative arc. This narrative acts as a psychological defense. Throughout a life, we experience massive prediction errors, a career failure, or the end of a relationship. Reality delivers a mismatch to our plans. The author utilizes the judgment of agency to reframe these events. Instead of internalizing failure as a flaw, the individual constructs a story where the loss was a necessary catalyst for discovering a truer purpose. Human resilience relies on this mechanism. Our ability to navigate the world rests on the underlying assumption that you are the sole author holding the pen to your life story. Today, that biological architecture faces a different threat. We are beginning to outsource our internal predictive models. We live in digital environments designed to track micro-hesitations, biometrics, and histories. Artificial intelligence and predictive algorithms utilize this data to construct intricate external forward models of our behavior. This raises a central question. What happens to your sense of self when an external AI algorithm can predict your desires and emotional reactions with more accuracy and less latency than your own cerebellum's efference copy? If an external digital prediction preempts your internal biological prediction, it short-circuits the very loop that anchors your sense of control. If we are not actively generating the boundaries of our own intentions, who is actually holding the pen? Are you still the autobiographical author of your life? Or are you becoming an NPC executing predictable code written by an unseen system? When we make a clear mistake, a selfish decision, or a careless error, our minds rarely default to immediate admission. Almost instantly, we generate logical-sounding excuses to justify the misstep, rather than simply accepting fault. In casual conversation, ego is a synonym for arrogance. We typically use it to describe an overinflated sense of self-importance or simple vanity. Acting out of character causes a far deeper internal crisis than we realize. This friction is processed as a biological-level threat to mental stability, far exceeding the weight of simple embarrassment. To understand this blind spot, we have to divide the mind into two distinct psychological entities. There is the structural content of your identity, and there is the active mechanism trying to manage it. When clinical psychology first mapped the mind, Sigmund Freud framed the ego as a structural mediator. Moving past his early models of primal urges and strict moral conscience, the ego emerged as a pragmatic negotiator for the mind's internal drives. It operates strictly on the reality principle. Its entire job is to satisfy our internal drives while minimizing pain and negative consequences from the external world. Self-deception is an operational procedure. The ego acts as an invisible manager, editing our perception of reality before we are even consciously aware of the incoming data. The psychologist Carl Rogers provided a framework for the content the ego is tasked with managing. He called it the self-concept, an internal database comprising everything you believe about who you are, from your factual self-image to your self-esteem and your aspirations. This database operates on the consistency principle, demanding all beliefs and incoming information remain perfectly aligned. It prioritizes internal coherence, even if rejecting objective truth. The modern ego is the executive mechanism maintaining that structure, responsible for problem-solving, self-control, and navigating reality. A critical system error occurs when undeniable objective reality clashes with the established self-concept. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. If you believe you are a patient person, but you lose your temper, the gap between self-image and lived experience creates an intolerable tension. The manager is caught between a reality it must navigate and a database that refuses to change. Faced with this clash, the internal system enters an immediate crisis of resource management. The stability of the entire identity structure is suddenly at risk. Mediating that cognitive dissonance and maintaining continuous self-regulation requires immense executive energy. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister demonstrated that willpower and executive function act as a finite, drainable mental resource. Every instance of emotional regulation or complex decision-making burns some of this fuel, leading to a state known as ego depletion. When the ego detects this depletion, it strategically enters a low-power mode. To conserve its remaining fuel, it takes the path of least resistance. Adjusting a core self-concept requires integrating a painful, contradictory truth. It demands complex reality testing and high energy. Denial, by contrast, is energetically cheap. Facing reality becomes too expensive for an exhausted manager. To save its limited fuel, a depleted ego actively sacrifices objective truth for internal stability. To prevent a total system collapse under this strain, the ego pulls from a toolkit of automatic defense mechanisms, actively editing the reality you experience. Through rationalization, it invents logical excuses to justify behavior. Through denial, it rejects the data entirely, warping information to fit the existing self-concept. And through projection, the ego externalizes an unacceptable internal flaw, projecting it onto others, so the internal database remains pristine. This dynamic reveals the mechanics of severe pathology. In narcissistic personality disorder, for example, an individual maintains a grandiose, perfect self-image, yet beneath that inflation, the internal database is incredibly brittle. Because the structure is so fragile, it becomes a parasitic drain. The ego spends its finite executive energy running aggressive defense protocols against any minor criticism, leaving no resources for learning or growth. The manager becomes a captive to the fragile identity it serves. It traps the individual in an exhausting, endless cycle of reality distortion, working full-time just to keep a false story alive. Psychological health is not achieved by destroying the ego. As developmental psychologist Erik Erikson outlined, a healthy identity requires the ego to successfully integrate a chaotic range of roles, values, and experiences over a lifespan. The researcher Jane Lovinger mapped this trajectory, showing that a mature, autonomous ego develops a high tolerance for ambiguity. It gains the capacity to hold paradoxes and internal conflicts without instantly triggering primitive defenses. A flexible manager allows for a resilient database. The self-concept can become nuanced, capable of acknowledging flaws alongside strengths, without fracturing under the weight of external shocks. This structural strength underpins Abraham Maslow's research on self-transcendence, a state characterized by moving beyond self-focused concerns. Maslow observed that you cannot safely minimize the boundaries of your ego or transcend your sense of self if that self is fragile. You must first build a robust, fully functional executive manager capable of handling reality before you can ever choose to let go of its centrality. If the internal manager is hardwired to bend reality to maintain consistency, it forces an audit of our own internal systems. What false, limiting, or negative beliefs are you currently wasting mental energy to defend? Recognizing that invisible editing process, catching your own manager in the act of a cover-up, is the essential first step toward true psychological maturity. In modern self-improvement circles, ego death is often sold as a spiritual shortcut. It's presented as a simple matter of letting go, the idea that if you can just dissolve your identity, you'll arrive at a state of perfect peace. But the clinical reality is different. When someone attempts to dismantle their ego without the necessary internal structure to support that expansion, the mind shatters. Exposing a weak psychological frame to the vast, unfiltered contents of the unconscious risks severe fragmentation rather than peace. This creates a structural requirement. To safely navigate self-transcendence, the ego must first be stable and highly integrated. You cannot relinquish a boundary that hasn't been fully formed. To see why, we have to use the formal definition of the ego. It isn't a measure of arrogance. In psychology, the ego is the executive processor, the internal manager responsible for maintaining the boundary between you and the rest of the world. Psychological growth isn't about destroying this manager. It's about understanding the hierarchical steps the manager takes to construct your reality. Identity begins at a neurological level with the feeling of agency, or FOA. This is the ego's baseline reality testing mechanism, operating as a background hum that confirms your physical actions belong to you. When you move your hand, the brain sends a motor command to your muscles and an internal memo to a prediction center. When sensory feedback matches that prediction, the system locks, generating the feeling you are the author. In conditions like schizophrenia, this system fails. The brain cannot reliably match its internal predictions with its actual movements, leading the individual to attribute their own thoughts or actions to external forces. When the baseline ability to predict our own origin fails, the boundary between self and other collapses, resulting in clinical disorientation. As we move from physical actions to psychological identity, we use the judgment of agency. This is the conscious thought process of claiming ownership over our life's successes and failures. To keep our internal story consistent, the ego filters objective reality. It smooths over data that doesn't fit our self-concept to maintain a sense of coherence. Immature ego structures do this aggressively, relying on defenses like denial or projection. They most push away any evidence that contradicts their rigid self-story. This filtering has a mechanical cost. Maintaining a rigid narrative while deflecting contradictory data drains the brain's finite executive fuel, a state known as ego depletion. Fighting reality and suppressing internal conflict leaves us with very little executive resource, resulting in a state of chronic burnout that halts further growth. To move past this burnout, the ego must mature into the autonomous stage. The ego is now stable enough to view reality as information rather than a threat. Carl Rogers described this efficiency as congruence. It occurs when there is minimal gap between your self-image, ideal aspirations, and actual gut-level experiences. A congruent ego can hold internal contradictions and paradoxes simultaneously. It no longer needs to waste energy on denial, being strong enough to tolerate ambiguity. This profound alignment marks the transition away from internal conflict, moving the ego into a state of complex, highly flexible integration. Achieving congruence ends the internal war of the immature ego, redirecting wasted psychological energy towards self-actualization. When the ego reaches this level of functional integration, it possesses the stability required for the final step. True transcendence is a volitional act of integration. It is the controlled overcoming of the barrier between the analytical, explicit system and the intuitive, implicit self. Carl Jung conceptualized this as the transcendent function, a mechanism that allows the conscious ego to synthesize its perspective with the broader contents of the unconscious. The ego intentionally relaxes its authorship filter, lowering its own boundaries without losing its executive stability. This allows the sense of agency to expand beyond the individual skin. It facilitates a connection to the collective through choice, rather than through a loss of control. The path of growth follows a hierarchy. The ego must become strong enough to consciously choose to relinquish its own borders. It is the shift from a rigid, highly defended self to a state that is fluid and fully integrated. What difficult truth or inner conflict are you currently blocking out to protect a fragile identity? And what energy could you unlock if you finally chose to integrate it? When a bone breaks, the diagnosis is linear. You see a jagged line, cast it, and heal it. But step into human psychology, and that clear map shatters. We enter a murky, subjective web of internal narratives and hidden expectations. In this framework, the ego represents the raw, unfiltered biological reality of the organism in this exact second. It is the real self, composed of your genuine emotional responses, your current biological state, and the unfiltered data of your lived experiences. This diagram maps out our internal conflict. The rough, asymmetrical shape represents that raw, biological ego. But layered directly over it is the self-concept. This is the highly curated, rigid mental avatar of who we firmly believe we are required to be, an internalized story built from social conditioning and family expectations. Friction occurs because of a natural tendency to identify more with that towering reflection than the actual person standing in the room. When our messy biological reality fails to match the immaculate posture of the avatar, it creates a constant, low-grade tension. When the gap between reality and expectation becomes impossibly wide, the ideal self stops acting as a motivational target. It becomes a metabolically draining internal tyrant, forcing the brain into a permanent state of failing to meet its own baseline requirements for worth. This trap is driven by conditional self-regard, where foundational human worth is entirely transactional. You exist on a state of permanent probation, only viewing yourself as lovable or capable if you meet highly specific, uncompromising standards. When you fail to meet these conditions, the brain makes a significant biological error. It misinterprets the inability to achieve the ideal as a literal threat to your survival, activating the same autonomic nervous system alarm bells as a physical attack. To protect the fabricated ideal self from this perceived threat, the mind launches a cover-up operation. The ego suppresses the raw data, warping your perception of reality to hide the failure. You might project your jealousy onto others, or numb your panic with overwork, abandoning your real self in its moment of distress. Funding this massive cover-up operation inside your own head consumes immense physical resources. Your processing power is constantly running in the background, filtering and distorting reality to sustain a lie. Chronic exhaustion and emotional numbness serve as visible symptoms of this internal friction. They represent the physiological burnout of a nervous system perpetually at war with its own biological data. The psychologist Carl Rogers established that the absolute prerequisite for stability is congruence, the degree of alignment between your real self and your ideal self. Closing that gap is difficult when the brain is locked in a state of biological panic. In these moments, logical arguments cannot penetrate an activated amygdala. You cannot outthink a biological threat response once it has taken hold. Breaking this cycle requires a direct, non-verbal biological intervention. A physical gesture of self-compassion, such as resting a hand over your heart or on your cheek, interrupts the brain's default threat response. This physical touch operates on an ancient neurological pathway. It taps directly into the mammalian caregiving system, speaking to your nervous system in a biological language it inherently trusts. The touch physically stimulates the vagus nerve, triggering the release of oxytocin. This cascade lowers your heart rate and downregulates cortisol production, successfully bypassing the critical spiraling brain entirely. Self-compassion functions as a mechanical override. By utilizing physical touch to stimulate the vagus nerve, you forcibly disarm the inner critic's power supply and shift the body back into a state of safety. Once the alarm bells are quieted, you can audit the rigid shoulds and musts dictating your behavior. Tracing those rules back to their origins often reveals they are outdated coping mechanisms inherited from critical environments, not inherent laws of physics. To address these rules, you apply the cognitive tool of acceptance without approval. This requires splitting your observation. You acknowledge the objective reality of a behavior, like procrastinating for 4 hours, without attaching that action to your fundamental identity. This cognitive separation removes paralyzing toxic shame. Because the failure is no longer viewed as an indictment of your soul, you possess the bandwidth and energy required to actually correct the behavior. Failure is treated as data, not a verdict. This shift changes your locus of evaluation. In a state of incongruence, you operate like a thermometer, passively reacting to external praise or societal metrics. But self-acceptance allows you to become the thermostat, trusting your own examined values to dictate your internal baseline. Reaching this congruent state, self-actualization, means neutralizing the internal biological threat. You integrate your messy, brilliant, and flawed parts into a secure identity, effectively stopping the war on two fronts. While fixing internal neuroses provides immense stability, Abraham Maslow's later theories reveal that self-actualization is not the final stage of development. Healing the ego is the prerequisite for moving beyond it. For all its health, self-actualization remains fundamentally bounded by an obsession with the ego and personal potential. It is still entirely focused on the I. Think of this safety briefing on an airplane. Dismantling conditional worth and establishing an internal locus of evaluation is the process of securing your own oxygen mask. But once that mask is steady, you possess the capacity to look outward and assist the rest of the cabin. A perfectly secure ego does not need to constantly assert its own existence. Because you are no longer terrified of suffocating, your psychological energy naturally moves outward into self-transcendence, connecting with humanity and a broader ultimate meaning. This transcendent state is often triggered by awe. Standing before the scale of a starry sky or a vast canyon forces the brain to process a physical reality that dwarfs the individual. It mechanically breaks the scale the ego uses to measure its own importance. This diagram illustrates transient hypofrontality. In moments of intense awe or focus, the parts of the prefrontal cortex responsible for self-monitoring literally quiet down. The internal critic goes offline, the perception of time vanishes, and the I disappears. You can also induce this state through radical, non-judgmental empathy. By repeatedly vacating your own worldview to inhabit another's, you practice a form of cognitive flexibility that degrades the rigid walls of the self-concept. Over time, this merging of perspectives habituates the brain to a broader, more inclusive identity. This represents a massive shift in perspective, moving the individual from the highly functional, individualized I to the transcendent, interconnected us. The arc of human development leads to a central irony. You spend years painstakingly building a secure, watertight identity solely so you possess the strength to abandon it and recognize your place within the whole. We often operate under the assumption that exposure equals learning. You watch a tutorial, you read a page, you listen to a lecture, and you expect the information to stick. But mere exposure is neurologically insufficient. Your brain is a metabolically stingy organ. Building new physical neural pathways requires a massive expenditure of glucose and oxygen, so the brain naturally resists rewiring itself. It protects its energy reserves by defaulting to the path of least resistance. To actually force the tissue to change, you need clearance from a highly evolved cognitive governance system. This is your prefrontal cortex. It operates as the strict executive gatekeeper for neuroplasticity. Measured observational. This level of control is entirely separate from basic vigilance. Just being awake and reacting to your environment is easy. True executive attention requires the exhausting, active suppression of every internal thought and external distraction competing for your mental space. Because altering brain structure is so expensive, it requires explicit authorization. Without that deliberate top-down command from the prefrontal cortex, sensory input is just fleeting noise. It vanishes without leaving a structural trace. This authorization process begins with an internal smoke detector called the anterior cingulate cortex. Its entire job is to detect errors or conflicts in your environment, flagging them so the prefrontal cortex can adjust its strategy and lock in its focus. Once the decision to focus is made, the prefrontal cortex has to transmit that intent down to the physical wiring. It does this by deploying a chemical bridge, built primarily out of dopamine and norepinephrine. This chart shows the relationship between dopamine levels and executive function. The dose response forms a distinct inverted U-curve. Contrary to popular belief, more dopamine does not equate to better focus. Down here on the left side of the curve, dopamine signaling is low. The result is brain fog, low motivation, and a complete inability to hold a demanding cognitive state. Over on the right side, high stress floods the system with an excess of dopamine and arousal chemicals. Attention splinters. Thinking becomes rigid, reactive, and panicked. Optimal cognitive flexibility and robust working memory exist only at the very peak of this curve. Maintaining this precise neurochemical balance is incredibly fragile, but hitting this exact sweet spot is the only way the brain can signal to its downstream learning centers that the current inputs are valuable enough to make permanent. Down on the microscopic cellular floor, memory becomes physical architecture. When a connection strengthens, it undergoes long-term potentiation. When the brain clears out irrelevant connections, the pathways shrink through long-term depression. This diagram illustrates the biological rules that dictate those changes, a process called spike timing dependent plasticity. At this scale, firing sequences are judged in mere milliseconds. If the input neuron fires just milliseconds before the output neuron, the brain logs the connection as predictive and useful. the synaptic pathway thickens. But if the timing is reversed and the input fires just milliseconds after the output, the brain flags the connection as noise. The pathway is actively pruned. This presents a mechanical paradox. If the rules for physical wiring operate on impossibly fast thousandth of a second timeframes, how do we learn complex skills over hours, days, or months of practice? The brain bridges this gap through behavioral timescale plasticity. Sustained focus from the prefrontal cortex chemically tags synapses, artificially stretching the eligibility window for those synapses to change, allowing the brain to link neural events separated by much longer periods of time. Without intense, sustained focus acting as a temporal glue, a brief moment of correct practice remains biologically isolated. Focus is the agent that binds those scattered moments together, accumulating them into a lasting memory. The physical rewiring of those synapses doesn't actually finish when you stop practicing. During deep non-REM sleep, the brain enters a secondary editing phase. It actively replays and reinforces the precise neural patterns you fired during your waking focus, pruning away the static and solidifying the signal. The biological motive behind all this effort is energy efficiency. The prefrontal cortex is a massive drain on resources. Through enough focused repetition, the brain shifts control away from that expensive executive center, moving it deep into the reflexive, automated circuits of the striatum. That neurological handover is what automation feels like. A demanding physical or cognitive sequence becomes effortless. The brain reclaims its cognitive bandwidth, freeing up the prefrontal cortex to handle brand new challenges. But there is a dangerous vulnerability in this system. Neuroplasticity is strictly activity dependent. It blindly obeys the signal of your focus, completely indifferent to whether that signal is actually good for you. Take a musician practicing for hours a day with a subtle flaw in their grip. Because their focus is intense and repetitive, the brain diligently hardwires that flawed tension into the motor cortex. It strengthens the wrong connections until the hand involuntarily cramps and curls, a debilitating condition known as focal hand dystonia. Focus is an unfeeling amplifier. The brain will build permanent physical architecture around whatever you direct your attention toward, securing the pathway, whether it leads to mastery or pathology. In clinical settings, this amplifier is deliberately weaponized. Following a stroke, patients understandably avoid using their paralyzed limbs, relying heavily on their healthy side. Because of this learned non-use, the cortical map representing the damaged limb physically shrinks from lack of attention. To reverse this, neurologists use constraint-induced movement therapy. It is a clinical intervention that forces the brain into an inescapable crisis of attention. By physically restraining the healthy limb for 90% of the day, the patient is forced to direct exhausting, targeted focus toward the damaged arm. That intense, unavoidable effort drives enough neural activity to physically expand the shrunken motor cortex back to a functional size. We see this same principle in neurofeedback training. When individuals use real-time brainwave monitoring to explicitly practice the internal mechanism of focus itself, rather than just practice in a test, they build highly adaptable neural strategies that successfully transfer to entirely new cognitive challenges. Whenever you fight to learn a complex subject, recover lost function, or master a physical movement, you are fighting to hit a very specific, energy-intensive biological threshold. Sustained, focused attention generates the physical force required to open the executive gate and rewrite the architecture of your own biology.